Hello, I'm Abraham Weil, and I'm an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at California State University, Long Beach. I want to offer gratitude to Norbese Flint and Drs. Ricks and Lenz for their overviews of their expertise. Watching them really helps me to think through my own contributions. Thanks too to Kamina Smith for sharing those with me and offering me some provocations to frame some of the issues facing Black queer folks in Los Angeles. Today, I'll begin by talking about some background and context. I'll offer a framework for how I'm thinking through these issues, discuss available statistics and community resources, and end with some recommendations. Because there's little data on Black queer people in LA, I'm going to attempt to frame that problem prior to taking a look at the statistics. My best suggestion when thinking about these statistics is that we look at the general statistics of Black life in LA, and for queer and trans people, move the needle up 2 to 6% to capture the impacts on the community. The reason being that the data alone doesn't really help to tell a good story here. We're talking about a population that's not only under-resourced, but also understudied. The data that we do have is easily debated, and much of it is poll data or small samples and can't really contend with the sort of nuance of Black queer life in LA or more broadly. This is changing somewhat, and new studies are currently underway, and particularly the case of Black queer youth. Since some terms might be field specific and because other terms have contextual definitions, I thought it would be useful to locate how I'm thinking through a couple of key terms here. I'm going to lean on Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism, which details here on the slide at least 5 key features. It's state supported, it's built on exploitation, comes to impact life chances, and accounts for the institutions that sort of differentiate and classify, but also names the process by which we internalize those kinds of logics. Second, I'll use queer and trans as shorthand for the broader LGBTQIA plus community. With regard to homophobia and transphobia, there's a shift in the literature that seems important to identify for how we're thinking about how to frame this within policy work. We know that homophobia and transphobia occur in a broader social context that systematically disadvantages queer and trans people and promotes and rewards anti-queer and anti-trans sentiment. The use of the term cisgenderism is sort of slowly increasing in the literature, particularly around left-leaning discourse. The shift originated, I think, out of an argument that homophobia and transphobia denote an inherent sort of assumption about anti-gay or anti-trans prejudice, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's largely based on the sort of idea that it's fear-based as opposed to something that's describing an underlying cultural ideology that really leads to sort of biased behaviors, attitudes, and policies. So historically, the terms homophobia and transphobia have been utilized more often than heterosexism or cisgenderism, but you see this slowly shifting. So the main reasoning being that these terms sort of offer a way into thinking about prejudice and discrimination as a more systematic issue, as opposed to something that comes from accident or lack of knowledge. Following Jennifer Nash on intersectionality, I want to think about the ways that intersectionality can move toward an analysis of oppression more generally. Nash's argument helps us to understand the ways that Black women have been made to be the sort of theoretical value added of intersectionality, and that the passive regard for it leaves it limited. Here, I'm trying to think about intersectionality as an essential part of my framework, and following Nash to think about the ways that different embodied experiences can be both general and specific when we think about the ways that they engage with power and access to resources. And finally, queer is a term that's coined by E. Patrick Johnson, and I'm drawing this quote here from Khayyam Green as a part of sort of remembering the simultaneous articulations of Blackness and queerness, and sort of thinking about the ways that queer signals a range of possibilities beyond just sort of queer hegemonic subject. So the number one problem in assessing data in LA is that we don't have it. In particular, I just sort of referenced Kai Green, but Dr. Green has an excellent dissertation out of USC entitled Into the Darkness, A Queer Remembering of Los Angeles in a Time of Crisis, which looks at the ways that Black queer folk sort of articulate and create and reconstruct different spaces within Los Angeles. So aside from this, we can access statistics in California, which if we allow to big data to sort of dictate the story here, means that we're looking at major problems in California's large cities. So the basic California statistics that I sort of picked out here, and there are more statistics here in the sort of broad sense, but that we're looking at about 1.2 million Black queer folks in California of the estimated sort of 13 to 14 million queer people in the United States. Of those 1.2 million, we're looking at about 40% people of color, 12% Black. Of those 1.2 million, about 36% in California are raising children. And I add that in to sort of give light to the second two statistics. The first being that 56% of queer Black people in Los Angeles are living below poverty. We're marking that at about the $24,000 amount. 79% of Black LGBT adults report verbal abuse, and 60% reporting physical violence. That's a statistic from the Williams Institute's 2019 policy briefing. So hopefully this is not too much of an aside, but next I would sort of like to frame the way that I see a path forward for Black queer trans folks here in LA and elsewhere. And the framework that I'm going to think about and use is the framework of abolition. A lot of this is drawn from a sort of collection of sources, which I'd be happy to share. But the way I'm thinking about this, right, is that there's a sort of three-phase process. The first is to sort of prefigure solidarity as a process. It means that we're thinking about abolition as a process as important as the end goal, right? And so the ways toward that I see are preventing harm, intervening on harm, having a process to repair harm and violence, and then looking to transform communities and relationships. Second, to look at systems of care, right? So the solidarity will require new logics of prevention, of intervention, and of transformation, and we could easily add there, right, reparations, the guiding principles being that no one is disposable and no one is innocent, and the suggestion of systems of care being to resist assumptions or word-of-mouth facts or stories about your uncle. My uncle I inherited a lot of stories from my own uncle, which is what that is there. And three, shifting questions, right? Avoiding the sort of red herring arguments. And I think this is especially important in Black communities, which has a sort of long and complicated history of the sort of ways that the after effects of plantation logics really impel the community with a particular kind of vantage point toward queerness, which shifts over time, but ultimately Black people are often blamed for being the sort of leading charge of homophobia in kind of the modern instantiation, which really doesn't give us an accurate or good place to move from, right? And then second, that the people most affected by any given situation should be at the center of decision making. I think that's what we're doing here in this group, and that those people can disagree, but should be willing to listen to each other, right? So I want to look at some statistics that we do have. Again, these are incomplete, and also we're looking at fairly small sample sizes, unfortunately. The first statistic is a sort of snapshot from Williams Institute. You'll recognize the chart from the opening slide. Much of the data available at the Williams Institute, when it is filtered for looking at Black communities, ultimately leaves us without a lot of options. So this is one place that we have, and we can see here in the darker blue that this is sort of representing Black LGBT populations, and in the lighter non-LGBT Black population. So if we look down, we can see clearly that queer Black folks in LA are underemployed, underinsured, facing higher levels of food insecurity and higher levels of low income status. Similarly, here we have proportions of Black queer people living below the 200% federal poverty level, and overall, sort of looking at this, we see the sort of presentation of men and women, and then overall, and we can see again in all categories that Black queer people are outpacing the larger Black community. Similarly here, we're looking at food insecurity as another issue, right? And I think the sort of chart can speak for itself, but we're looking at the differences between people who can afford meals at all, people who are receiving food stamps, people who are unable to get balanced meals, people who are experiencing sort of very nuanced levels of food insecurity, which I think is sort of an important thing to think about when we're thinking about the geography of Los Angeles as well. And then I think importantly, I wanted to sort of pause on the statistics around HIV, which are sort of rampant within the Black, queer, and trans community. Nationally, these are the statistics, but we're really looking at the larger cities in the United States when we look at these statistics based on where the data is coming from. So we're looking at 15% of transgender women who are HIV positive. But when we break that down and look at Black trans women, we're looking at 44%. So the jump from 15 to 44 is a pretty egregious statistic that I think we should really be focusing on. And this comes from a publication in 2020. So these are sort of our most recent statistics nationally. And then in terms of sort of looking at economic disparities, we are looking at a sort of a similar story again. But again, the chart that is sort of comparing, these numbers are comparing the queer folks to the sort of Black community at large. But we see here that Black queer adults are more likely to experience economic insecurity than other Black folks. So nearly 40% of Black queer folks are living with a household income under $24,000 per year, compared to 33%. They're more likely to be unemployed at 14% compared to 10%, and to experience food insecurity, 37% compared to 27%. Further, the disparities in food insecurity is much more pronounced within Black queer and non-queer women, looking at 41% versus 29%. And over half, looking at like 56% of Black queer adults are now living in low-income households below that mark of the 200% poverty level, compared to 49% of adults who are not queer, so about 7% higher there. I think one of the ways that we can think about this, right, is through thinking about family, the Black family, and kinship networks more broadly. The Human Rights Campaign did a study in 2019 that reported 77% of Black queer youth hearing negative things about queerness from family members, 47% of them reporting being mocked or taunted, 59% reporting that their families are actively sort of discriminating against them for being queer. And I think the sort of last statistic, which I think gets to kind of the larger affective charges that we're trying to deal with through our policymaking, that only 19% report feeling safe in their family, with 90% of Black queer youth reporting sleep issues between 8 and 10. And we can think of those as sort of shortening life chances and creating sort of longer-term health effects. The incomplete sort of resource list that I have here is really just to sort of get us started. I'm sure I'm missing key partners, but I was trying not to sort of reproduce partners that might be elsewhere on our lists. In terms of recommendations, I have some general recommendations. The first is that a community assessment of Black queer communities in Los Angeles would be incredibly helpful. Power map of possible funders with specific focuses on LGBTQ health. Support for Black queer elders, specifically who are living in assisted living facilities where we have nearly no data and very little oral history collection happening. We should be thinking about substance abuse and treatment, identifying resources for sexual health needs, especially as it is related to people living with HIV, identify emotional and mental health needs specific to Black queer populations in Los Angeles, fund and develop social and mentorship and leisure spaces for Black people in Los Angeles, working toward decriminalizing sex work. And I would suggest, right, that schools and universities are particularly adept to answer some of these issues, and I think that we could do some of this through our universities as we head into larger policy recommendations. In terms of policy recommendations, I have just a few here, or just three rather here, to construct and disseminate letters to local officials and request sort of in-person meetings to address specific concerns of Black, queer, and trans communities. Funds, getting money into people's hands, of course, and to kind of look at the possibility of proposing a sort of the first, as far as I can tell, large-scale grant to address issues of Black queer people in LA. I know that there was a question about whether there should be its own sort of standalone portion, or if this should be kind of put throughout each of our sort of policy sections, and I think the answer is both, right? I think that there's a way to both include it, but also to be honest about the statistics that are drastically higher for queer and trans Black folks here. And then finally, to sort of support research on discrimination in local policies, particularly policing, I think, but that generally address Black sexual identity and expression orientation more broadly. And I think following basically Flint's argument around reproductive justice, I think this is actually a similar kind of call that we can think about how to hold these things in kind of larger meshworks and larger points of connection. That's all I have for this presentation, but I'd be happy to answer any questions or give any sort of additional pieces of information. Again, because we have so little policy, I think it's sort of at our feet to gather and try and disseminate and make demands that are specific to Black queer life in Los Angeles. I think that this will not only help us in our larger mission of liberation, but it will carry on sort of lasting effects for other minoritized populations here in Los Angeles. Again, my name is Abe Weil, and you can contact me here. I look forward to speaking with you and answering any questions you might have.